Hey folks, it's Miss Sinclair for AP World History Modern. Today we are continuing on with our lectures on Unit 4, Transoceanic Connections. We are looking at topic 4.3 today, looking at the conquest of the Americas and the Columbian Exchange. So, what allowed for transatlantic exploration? Last lecture we talked about the motivations for European exploration, as well as the technology and circumstances that made it possible. Today, we are talking about the conquest of the Americas and the Columbian Exchange. So our objective is 4.3, the Columbian Exchange. We will be looking at the causes of the Columbian Exchange and its effects on both the Eastern and Western hemispheres. So you should be able to explain these things at the end of our lecture. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the Americas before the arrival of the Europeans. Well, we know that the Spanish will be able to establish a vast territorial empire in the Americas. This is going to be really different from what the Portuguese do. The Portuguese established primarily a trade empire. So think about what the Portuguese were doing in Africa and the Indian Ocean. They were just controlling a few ports and fortresses, but they weren't necessarily governing land. What we see in the Americas is that the Spanish are going to govern land. So their empires look different, but their motivations and their methods of using technology will be the same. So, on the island of Hispaniola, you are going to have the Arawak peoples. The Arawak peoples are going to primarily cultivate maize, cassava, sweet potatoes, hot peppers, cotton, tomato. They have the practice of gold metallurgy, and they will eventually exaggerate the presence of gold in other places to try and get the Spanish to leave their island. So I think a couple things is important to note before we jump into it. We didn't talk about the Americas at all last unit, but we have talked about them in the past. We've talked about the Mayans, the Aztecs, the Incas, as well as native groups in North America like the Pueblo peoples, the mound builders, Cahokia. And I just want to remind you that the myth that the Americas were a relatively pristine place, that nature was untouched by human intervention, that the population density of the Americas was so low that the native peoples were backwards and undeveloped. These are all false myths, right? In fact, this false myth is really harmful for how we understand the Americas. So, for example, let's take it piece by piece. The natural environment of the Americas was not untouched by human intervention, right? If one of our AP themes is looking at interactions with the environment, well, we know over in the old world, so to speak, Europe, Eurasia, Africa, that people have been adapting their natural environment to suit their needs, building irrigation, building canals. I mean, we know that the Dutch are like draining their land to create more land. We talked about sort of deforestation during this time in Europe. So we have this expectation that, of course, in the old world, that humans are changing and adapting the land. We are cutting down forests, we are building roads, we are redirecting rivers. Well, peoples in the Americas are doing the exact same thing. We know that one of the causes of the medieval warm period was, in fact, human intervention because of the massive use of slash and burn to clear land in the Americas. It was happening on such a scale that it contributes to global warming. And then the arrival of the Europeans and the huge loss of life will contribute to the little ice age as that slash and burn stops. We know that the native peoples have been changing the natural environment, whether it's the Incas with their roads and terracing the Andes Mountains, native peoples clearing forests with slash and burn, the Aztecs and the Mexica building chinampas in rivers, the Pueblo peoples building cave dwellings. So there are lots of people living here, and they are changing the natural environment. And although the population density is less than that of what we will see in Afro-Eurasia, it is still massive. There are millions of people living in the Americas. It's not like there's 5 that the Spanish happened to stumble across. And while they are not going to have all of the same technological breakthroughs of the Europeans, they are by no means living as, cavemen, right? They have complex societies, complex social hierarchies, bureaucracies, internal infighting. Think about all the complexity of our old world, of medieval infighting in Europe between the Pope and kings, of the drama in the Chinese courts. We have that as well. So I think it's really helpful to not buy into this myth that the Native Americans are simple people who just were like in awe of Europeans. Remember what I said a long time ago. When Europeans arrive, the instinct of the native peoples is not going to be, oh my gosh, these are gods I must worship. It's, how can I use you to leverage my position in my society? So we will see that indigenous groups will partner with the Spanish to defeat the Aztec, because the Aztecs have been their historic enemies and have been very oppressive, right? So that's my soapbox. I encourage you to read the book 1491 if you haven't, if you're interested in the complexity of Amerindian society prior to the arrival of Columbus. But let's start talking about what happens as the Europeans arrive. So conquistadors. Conquistadors are early 16th century, so 1500s, Spanish adventurers who will conquer Mexico, Central America, and Peru. There's a link between conquistadors and Christianity. You have to remember, in the Iberian Peninsula, you have this uniquely militant Christianity. And this militant Christianity really starts prior to the discovery of the Americas. It starts with the wars in the Iberian Peninsula with the Muslim kingdoms. And so they will use these same methods that Spain had used for centuries against the Muslims in the Americas against indigenous groups. So conquistadors will seek to serve God by defeating non-believers and placing them under Christian control, in the process becoming rich. So I think an important asterisk to put by all of these situations and throughout history, whenever you have people saying they're doing things in the name of God, of their God, whatever it might be, I think it's important to view that line of justification with a little bit of hesitancy, right? It's really easy to say, I'm doing it for God. That doesn't necessarily mean their motivations are actually religious. There are going to be people for whom their motivations are religious, especially when we see Jesuits and monks coming over to the Americas. But saying it, I'm doing it for God, sounds a lot better than, I'm doing it because I want to kill a bunch of people and take their money, right? So religion is linked to warfare in this time period, but it would be incorrect to simplify the motivation of all of the conquistadors to simply religion. So a couple conquistadors you should know. One is Hernan Cortez. Hernan Cortez is going to lead the conquest of the Aztecs. So he arrives on the Yucatan Peninsula. They really make their home base in like sort of Cuba, Hispaniola, Caribbean islands, and then they sail across the Yucatan Peninsula, and Cortez begins to conquer Mayan groups they come across. They also encounter groups that have been subjugated by the Aztecs. So I think one of the important things to remember here is, yes, you will have some warfare, but also the Europeans are very aware that they're outnumbered here, right? And so they are looking to find allies as well. So they encounter groups subjugated by the Aztecs and indicate that they are like interested in this big empire. And these groups that have been subjugated are like, these outsiders, I bet I can use them to overthrow my enemy who's been like kidnapping my people, taxing me like crazy, sacrificing my nobles. So Cortez will in fact get a native translator / mistress, and using her to help communicate, they will conquer the Aztecs. So natives willingly participate in the Spanish conquest of the Aztecs. Now, you have to also remember, no one at this time in the entire world understands about germ theory. Germ theory will not emerge until the late 19th, early 20th century. So no one understands that helping these people would do anything more than change the power balance. They don't know that interacting with the Europeans and bringing them further into the Americas is spreading a biological agent as well. So Montezuma is our Aztec emperor who's in charge during this time. He will respond first with the arrival of the Spanish with diplomacy rather than force. Right, so he's going to welcome them into Tenochtitlan, use lots of ceremonies. Cortez is leading about 600 men. And the thing is, they do have Spanish weaponry. So they do have gunpowder. They do have armor. And when they arrive, they capture and will eventually kill Montezuma. And this is in line with the legend of Quetzalcoatl, right? One of the Aztec gods. And in part, it has to do with like this god is often shining and the way the light reflected off their armor. So this was made possible by their Indian allies and the Doña Marina, which is what she becomes known, but this Indian mistress and translator who will give Cortez insight into all of these different group dynamics. But of course, unintentionally, they are also spreading smallpox. So, let me back up a little bit in the story. Cortez arrives in Tenochtitlan. He is welcomed. Cortez says, "We come in peace," and then imprisons the king, loots the treasury, massacres hundreds during a festival. This will, of course, start a rebellion because there's more people in Tenochtitlan, which, by the way, was better organized than most European cities and much cleaner. The Spanish flee, and many people will die in this conflict. So in 1521, Tenochtitlan will be burned to the ground and Mexico City will be constructed on its ashes. So most of central Mexico will become New Spain. You are also going to have, please watch this. It's will give you useful insight into Hernan Cortez. It's from the History Channel. You're also going to have men like Francisco Pizarro. So Pizarro is another Spanish explorer. He is known for conquering the Inca in Peru. Now, Atahualpa is the last ruling emperor of the Incas. And the Incas, in fact, are very vulnerable during this time because they had just had this massive, bloody, long civil war. So their fighting forces were weak, and they were fatigued. The power of Atahualpa was really not very solidified. So Pizarro arrives with a small force and captures the king. He tells all the other Incas, fill this room with treasure, with gold, and I will let your king go. They do it. They fill it with gold. Pizarro kills Atahualpa anyway, conquers the capital, Cusco, and begins to subjugate the native peoples. It's going to be in the Andes Mountains, in the mine of Potosi, where the Spanish start to get a lot of silver. You have other conquistadors as well. You have Vasco de Balboa, who establishes a colony in Panama. You have Francisco de Coronado, who's searching for the 7 cities of gold. He's the one who, why we have mountains named after him. He's going to march across the Sonoran Desert in armor. It's what will establish Spanish presence in the Southwest as we know it. He gets as far as Kansas, in fact. By 1570, we have 192 Spanish cities established throughout the Americas. And European migration to the New World is one of the longest continuous migrations in history. So, why did Spain establish an empire in the New World, and how did it happen? Let's start talking about the Columbian Exchange. Okay, so the Columbian Exchange is the big concept really to take out of this. It's helpful to know about the conquistadors, but the Columbian Exchange is huge. Simply put, the Columbian Exchange is this exchange of disease, plants, animals, and people between the old world and the new. So with the Columbian Exchange, we see massive demographic changes. So the crude death rate in the Americas is going to skyrocket. It is absolutely devastating. So between the spread of smallpox and measles, 50 to 80% of all indigenous populations will die. Entire island populations will be gone. Right? So central Mexico will go from 25 million people in 1519 to 2 million in 1580. Just think about the huge loss of culture, of language, of history, of knowledge, of identity, as well as just the grief. There are going to be other consequences as well. When you have this much, 80% of your population dead, you can't have a functioning economy, right? You can't have a functioning society with your population cut by 80%. So the Europeans did not intend for this at all. There are many, 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 many terrible, absolutely horrific things that the Europeans are going to intentionally do. But they did not intentionally kill 80% of the Native Americans. They had no reason to think that their mere presence would cause this cascade of effects. Native Americans had not been previously exposed to these diseases. They had no natural immunities. Their isolation, in fact, had put them at a biological disadvantage. Then, the specific, intentional, brutal working conditions that the Spanish will impose on the surviving natives will, force them to have lowered immune systems as well, leaving them more vulnerable to disease. So native peoples will suffer tremendously as a result of intentional and unintentional European actions. This also means that Europeans had room, so to speak, to create new populations with their own citizens and African slaves. Right? So this is one of the reasons why the American societies look so different than what we see in Asia, is because in Asia, when the Europeans arrive, they don't wipe out the indigenous populations and then just repopulate the land. So when we think about the destruction of the Amerindian societies, we have questions about the debates of the morality of conquest. Now, it's easy for us to look back and say these are all terrible things. And it's easy to assume that people in that time just accepted it wholeheartedly because it was a more brutal time or whatever. But that's not true. There were critics of the conquest of the Americas. There are going to be people within the Spanish and Portuguese systems, specifically Jesuit priests often, who will be very critical of the actions of the Spanish and how horrific they are. So some of the questions that emerge out of this are the natives fully human? Should they be controlled? What if they refuse to convert to Christianity? Father Bartolome de las Casas will suggest African slaves instead, which obviously is not a perfect solution when you're looking for a clean moral slate. But we see this huge disruption of social and economic structures as well as the biological impact. So the Columbian Exchange, like I said, is an exchange between the old world and the new. And what's being exchanged is plants, animals, and diseases. So let's talk a little bit about the new and old world. It is important that you know some of the things that are shared to and from, right? So let's see, do I have a slide with this? Yeah. From the New World, you have potatoes, tomatoes, corn, vanilla, rubber, cacao, avocados, tobacco, pumpkins, peanuts, cashews. And the arrival of these crops in the European and Afro-Eurasian systems will cause for a massive population boom after 1700 because these crops grow so effectively around the world. They have denser calories and it will increase the carrying capacity of the land. Better food security will lead to population growth. From the old world to the new, you see the exchange of peas, rice, sugarcane, wheat, coffee, citrus, apples, bananas, garlic, onion, and opium. So the crops that I've underlined are the ones you should really know. Settlers will bring staples of Southern European agriculture. They will also introduce African and Asian cash crops. Again, many of these crops just grow very successfully in these other environments. All right, what about animals? Well, the New World sends turkeys, llamas, alpacas, which I'm still not convinced are not the exact same thing, and the guinea pig. The Old World sends horses, goats, sheep, cows, chickens. So think about how the Plains Indians' lives will really be transformed by the horse. It's going to make it possible for them to really hunt the buffalo. Or the Navajo and herding sheep, right? Many Native American groups will take advantage of these new animals. However, the introduction of animals is going to be incredibly destructive to the native biodiversity of the Americas. And grazing animals will often just be left to wander, and they would wander into Native American farm plots and trample their crops. So they're already starving. Most of their family's dead. They have a little garden that they're using to feed themselves, and a cow walks through and tramples and eats everything. You also have the introduction of animals unintentionally, like rats, insects that will destroy native crops. Rats will kill baby birds, So you have unintentional exchange of biodiversity, as well as intentional introductions. You also have diseases. So obviously we know the old world gave the new world sort of a lot more diseases, but the Americas gave something back, specifically syphilis. Syphilis will come from the Americas and they will take it back to Europe, and it spreads very quickly because everyone has sex. The old world will also give plague, chickenpox, cholera, flu, leprosy, malaria, measles, smallpox, typhoid, and yellow fever. So please watch this one. It's going to be from a scientific perspective, but it's really important that you understand the consequences of the Columbian Exchange on both the Americas and the Afro-Eurasian system. It's important that you understand their impact on society as well as the natural environment. So I'm not going to check for this, but I would encourage you in your notes to create your own visual illustrating the Columbian Exchange, showing the animals that go back and forth or crops or whatever. All right, let's do a few practice questions. So, source-based question, pause it if you need it. Alfred Crosby, world historian, in 1967. Oh, sorry, that was meant to be on the previous slide. Which of the following best describes Alfred Crosby's argument in the passage above? All right, here's another source. Population of Central America. Which of the following best explains the overall population trend in Central America shown on the chart? The historical trend represented by the chart is most similar to which of the following? So, for your summary, explain the causes of the Columbian Exchange and its effects on both the Eastern and Western hemispheres. There's a lot more to this topic than we were able to cover today. I encourage you to look at your textbook for this topic and do your own research if it's something you're really interested in. If you have any questions, please ask. Thanks for listening.